Samira Vale was 36 years old when the first doorway appeared in the middle of a supermarket aisle between canned soup and laundry detergent. As if reality had made a clerical error and forgotten to hide the seam. At first, people thought it was a stunt. Someone filmed on a shaking phone, while a child cried somewhere off camera, and a store manager kept repeating that everyone needed to remain calm. The doorway stood upright without a wall around it, a clean rectangular frame of pale silver light, tall enough to walk through, deep enough to suggest distance even though there was no thickness to it all. On one side, the fluorescent misery of a Tuesday afternoon. On the other, a life that belonged to the person standing in front of it. Not a random dream, not an illusion, a version of their own life, altered by one choice. The woman who entered first came back 12 minutes later, unable to speak. Her mascara had run down both cheeks. She was holding a little pink sneaker to her chest with both hands like it was the most precious object in the universe. In our world, her daughter had died at age 4 from fever that arrived too fast and left too little time. In the world beyond the doorway, she had taken the child to a different hospital on a different night because years earlier she had accepted a better-paying job in another city. The hospital was closer. The doctor was on duty. The girl lived. Within hours, the world changed. Doorways began appearing everywhere, in train stations, apartment rooftops, church parking lots, university halls, the shoulder of a desert highway at 3 a.m, never two in the same place, never for long, always for someone specific. And every doorway offered the same thing, a passage into a life built from a road not taken. Governments tried to quarantine them. Scientists tried to measure them. Religious leaders tried to name them. None of it mattered. The doorways ignored politics, theory, and prayer with equal indifference. They operated on a more intimate law, one so old and human, it barely needed language. What if I had chosen differently? At first, most people only looked. You could stand before a doorway and see the other life opening beyond it like a wound or a miracle. A different spouse, a different city, a body untouched by old injury, a career that survived, a child born instead of lost, a war avoided because one enlistment paper was never signed. The air on the other side even smelled different. Rain instead of dust, bread instead of antiseptic, pine instead of smoke. It was never abstract. It was immediate, physical, humiliatingly personal. And once the first flood of fear passed, people started stepping through. Some came back in minutes, shaking with relief, newly grateful for the life they had. Others returned hollow-eyed, ruined by comparison. But a few, a growing few, did not return at all. That was what terrified everyone, because the doorways did not merely show alternate lives. They allowed permanent transfer. If you stayed past the threshold long enough, the doorway vanished behind you, and then, according to every test anyone could devise, you were simply gone. Samira watched all this the way most people watch the end of certainty, from a safe distance, through screens, from behind sarcasm. She lived alone on the 12th floor of a river-facing apartment in Chicago. She restored audio archives for a museum no one visited unless it rained. Her workdays were filled with dead voices, war diaries, lost interviews, static bitten field recordings from people long buried under names that no longer meant much to anyone. She cleaned them, amplified them, and tried to save what was left. It suited her. The less generous version of the truth was that Samira had become very skilled at living around an absence. 9 years earlier, her husband Elias had died in a commuter rail collision on a winter morning that was ordinary until it wasn't. He had missed one train, caught another, sat in a different car than usual. Such tiny decisions, so insultingly small, and yet they had delivered him exactly where death was waiting. People told Samira time would teach her how to carry it. Time taught her something else. It taught her how to make grief look civilized. She learned to answer emails, attend birthday dinners, laugh at careful jokes, water plants, pay taxes, and sleep on one side of the bed without ever once feeling that her life had resumed. It had not resumed. It had simply continued in a more administrative form. So when the world became obsessed with doorways, she refused to go near one. Her brother Joao begged her to at least look if one ever appeared for her. Her colleague Menesio argued that refusing evidence was a kind of superstition. Every news channel on Earth ran stories about closure tourism, about people returning healed or shattered or transformed. Samira turned the volume down and went back to restoring a 1962 tape from an Antarctic survey crew who sounded, through all that hiss and distance, lonelier than any humans had a right to be. Then one Thursday evening in October, she unlocked her apartment, stepped inside, and found a doorway standing in her living room where the armchair should have been. She froze with her keys, still in her hand. The silver frame glowed softly, not bright enough to hurt, just bright enough to make the room around it feel temporary. Through it she could see a kitchen filled with warm yellow light. She recognized the blue ceramic bowl on the counter before she recognized a man leaning against the sink. Elias, not a memory, not a projection. Elias at 40, a little older than the last version of him she had ever touched. He wore a dark green sweater she had never seen and reading glasses he had once promised, jokingly, to avoid forever. He was rinsing spinach in a metal colander and speaking to someone she could not yet see. Then a girl ran into frame. 8, maybe 9 years old. Bare feet, wild black curls, a gap between her front teeth. She skidded across the kitchen tiles with a pencil in one hand and a notebook in the other. Baba, if Europa has an ocean, could something big live in it? Elias laughed. The sound hit Samira with such force she had to grab the wall to remain standing. Yes, he said, something big always lives where people haven't looked long enough. The girl disappeared again. Elias turned as if he had heard something from Samira's side, and for one impossible second his eyes met hers across the threshold. There was no confusion in them, no fear, only recognition so immediate and intimate it stripped the air from her lungs. Sam, he said. The key ring fell from her hand and hit the floor. She did not remember crossing. One moment she was in her dim apartment with the smell of city rain coming through cracked glass. The next she was standing on warm tile while a pot simmered on the stove and a child stared up at her with Elias's eyes and her own mouth and said very softly, "Mama." The story of what happened over the next few days was told badly by everyone except Samira, because no one could decide whether what she did was brave, selfish, pathological, or sacred. She was supposed to come back. That was the rule. Enter, witness, learn, return. Instead, Samira stayed. At first, she told herself it was temporary. 1 hour became 1 night. 1 night became 3 days. Elias, in this world, had survived because she convinced him to cancel that train trip years ago after a fight about something neither of them could remember now. They had stayed married. Their daughter, Layla, had been born 2 years later. Samira, instead of drifting into archival work, had become a lecturer in acoustic cognition. They lived in a townhouse lined with books, unfinished science projects, and the small domestic clutter that grief had stolen from her own life so completely she had forgotten how holy it looked. It should have felt fake. It didn't. That was the unbearable part. The kettle sounded right. Elias's hand on the small of her back felt right. Layla's voice from the upstairs landing, complaining about math homework, was so exactly what her heart had been building in secret for years that Samira began to understand why some people never returned. Not because they were weak, not because they were deluded, because the body knows home faster than philosophy does. She called her brother on the 3rd day using the townhouse landline, because somehow the old world was still reachable while the doorway remained open behind her. "Come back," Joao said immediately before she could speak. He sounded like he had not slept. "Samira, please. You saw him. That's enough." Enough for what? For knowing. For peace. She looked through the kitchen window. Elias was helping Layla tape cardboard fins onto a model rocket. Their heads bent together in the amber afternoon. "I don't think peace is what this is," she said. His silence frightened her more than his pleading had. "Then what is it?" Samira watched Elias laugh at something Layla said. The sight broke her in a place so deep she could hear the fracture. "It's theft," she whispered. "Or correction. I can't tell." "You're not theirs," Joao said. The words lingered after the line went quiet. Not theirs. But the deeper horror had already begun to take shape inside her, because it was accompanied by another question, one she could not forgive herself for asking. What if they were more hers than the life she left behind? By the end of the first week, there were officials outside the doorway in her apartment, scientists, negotiators, theologians, all waiting for her to emerge, so they could ask the same blunt question the world had started asking about every non-returning traveler. What gives you the right to choose a better life when another version of you already lives there? No one knew the answer. The doorways seemed to merge identities without conflict. If the alternate self had been present before crossing, they were not found afterward. There was no corpse, no duplication, no sign of displacement. The simplest explanation was also the most disturbing. The doorway did not move a person between realities. It selected one continuity and erased resistance. Samira tried not to think about that, but the world would not let her forget it. The broadcast came through the house. People argued about morality with the bored intensity of those not yet personally threatened by a miracle. Some called stayers deserters. Others called them pioneers. A philosopher in Geneva said the doorways had exposed the central hypocrisy of civilization. People worship choice right up until someone makes an irreversible one. On the 12th day, the first thing went wrong. Layla forgot a story they had shared the previous evening. Not in the normal way children forget. Completely. Samira mentioned the ocean creature conversation from dinner, and Layla looked at her blankly and said, "What ocean creature?" At breakfast, Elias reached for his coffee with his left hand instead of his right. By lunch, he insisted he had always been left-handed. That night, Samira found one of her lecture books on the shelf with a title she had never written. The house was changing around her. At first, the alterations were small. A photograph shifting from beach to forest. A scar missing from Elias's wrist. The date on Layla's school calendar wrong. By 2 days. Then bigger things followed. Streets outside arranged themselves differently. Neighbors introduced themselves with names Samira had never heard. The model rocket became a violin case. Conversations she remembered from that morning had no afternoon counterpart. Reality here was not stable. It was revising. Samira stopped sleeping. She began taking notes, recording every inconsistency in a notebook she hid under the mattress. The patterns were subtle but relentless. The more she chose this world, the more this world rearranged itself around the choice, not to preserve coherence, but to respond to her wanting, her fear, her doubt, her guilt. Possibility was not fixed here. It was reactive. By the 3rd week, she understood something no one outside could yet see. The doorway had not shown her an alternate life. It had shown her a negotiable one. She called Min SEO from the townhouse office at 2:11 a.m., while Elias and Layla slept upstairs. "I need you to listen carefully," Samira said. Min SEO did not waste time on comfort. "Go. I think the world on this side isn't pre-existing. I think it's forming around decisions in real time. That's impossible." "Yes. Evidence." Samira gave it to her, all of it. The memory drift, the environmental edits, the way objects seemed to select whichever history best matched her emotional state. When she was calm, the house stabilized. When she panicked, details changed. When she wondered what Layla might have been like if she loved music instead of astronomy, the rocket became a violin case. Min SEO said nothing for several seconds. Then, "You think the doorway is not a portal. I think it's an engine." "For what?" Samira looked toward the ceiling, toward the people she loved in the rooms above her, or the people made from her love. The distinction had become unbearable. "For choice," she said. Min SEO inhaled sharply. "Come back now." "I can't." "You absolutely can." "No." Samira said, and now the truth was too large to hide from herself. I can't because if I leave, I lose them. And if I stay, I may be helping this thing rewrite reality at scale. Those are the options. There's always another option. Samira almost laughed. That had once been her favorite lie. But after the call ended, she sat in the dark office until dawn and realized Minicio had been right in the most devastating way possible. There was another option. She could refuse to choose. The next morning, when Elias kissed her forehead and asked whether she'd slept, Samira looked at him for a long time before answering. He smiled with affection and concern and a familiarity so complete it made her grief feel almost obscene, like a habit she had kept too long. "Elias," she said quietly, "do you ever feel like this place is waiting for me to decide what it is?" He studied her with an expression she could not read. Then he said, "What do you think every world is?" Something cold moved through her. Layla laughed from the dining room. A spoon clattered. Outside, a delivery drone passed a window with a low insect hum. The morning looked ordinary enough to trust, which was exactly why she no longer did. That evening, Samira went back to the doorway. It still stood in the apartment she had left behind, visible from this side as a pale frame opening onto her dark living room. Officials remained beyond it, dim shapes in sterile coats. Cameras watched. The whole planet, by then knew her name, knew she had stayed longer than anyone in recorded history, knew something was happening around her doorway that did not happen around others. Doorways worldwide were lasting longer. More people were crossing. Fewer were returning. Reports of instability had begun appearing everywhere. Small contradictions, memory splits, photographs changing, public records revising themselves overnight. The engine was spreading. Samira stood before the threshold and finally understood the true cruelty of the phenomenon. It had never been giving humanity what it wanted. It had been teaching humanity what reality was. Not matter, not law, not fate, selection. Every life, every identity, every history was a past stabilized by repeated choices until it hardened into the story we call the real world. The doorway simply removed the usual cost of reaching for another version. It exposed the mechanism underneath existence and handed ordinary people a lever they were never meant to see. And now the lever was stuck, because she had not left. A voice came from behind her. Not Elias, not Layla. The sound was older than language and somehow intimate enough to feel like her own thoughts returning after a long trip. She turned, and in the hall between kitchen and stairs there was no one there, only a flicker in the air, a geometry too wrong to focus on directly. When it spoke, the house lights dimmed. "You remain between affirmations," it said. Samira's mouth went dry. "What are you?" The witness produced when a chooser hesitates. "Did you make this?" "No." "You do." The thing shimmered closer. The walls around it bent like reflections in disturbed water. This structure was initiated by your species long before the visible gates emerged. Each unrealized decision generates latent branches. Most collapse. Some persist. Your technologies, grief patterns, and predictive systems increase branch retention. Eventually the boundary became traversable. Samira stared at it. "You're telling me humanity built this by regretting too efficiently?" A crude but acceptable summary. She almost smiled, then didn't. "And if I walk back through, this branch loses primacy. And if I stay, your indecision continues recursive proliferation. Convergences fail. Baseline coherence degrades. The world you call original will become no more or less real than this one." Samira looked toward the dining room, where Layla was humming to herself over homework. She looked toward the doorway where her apartment waited on the other side, stripped of warmth, stripped of Elias, stripped of the child who had never existed there. Then she asked the only question that mattered. "Which one is my real life?" The geometry in the hall went still. There is no answer independent of commitment. The word struck her harder than any revelation yet, because in that instant, beneath all the terror, She recognized the oldest hunger in the human soul, not merely to choose, but to be told that the choice had been correct, to be guaranteed, absolved, protected from the ache of roads abandoned. The doorway had conquered the world because it offered a fantasy more seductive than immortality, the fantasy that no life had to be lost for another to be lived. But every life was exactly that, a field of losses arranged into one survivable shape. Samira walked to Layla's room first. She stood in the doorway watching her daughter, her almost daughter, her constructed daughter, her beloved impossible daughter, fall asleep with a science magazine open across her chest. Samira kissed her forehead and tasted salt because she was already crying. Then she found Elias in the kitchen, rinsing cups beneath warm water, and for a moment she hated the universe with enough purity to understand religion. He turned and saw her face. "You know," he said. She nodded. He set the cup down carefully. "Am I real to you?" She stepped closer until she could feel his breath. "Yes," she said. "That's the problem." Elias touched her cheek with such gentleness that it nearly destroyed her. "No," he whispered. "That's the answer." She left him there, because staying another second would have changed her mind. At the threshold, the silver light trembled. Beyond it, her old apartment waited with its plain walls and silent rooms and the life that had hurt her so badly she had once believed it empty. Scientists shouted something from the other side, but she could not hear them clearly through the pulse in her ears. Samira placed one hand on the frame. Then she did the one thing no one had done. She stepped neither forward nor back. She sat down in the exact center of the doorway, one leg in each world, and closed her eyes. Around her, the light rose into a howl. Reality convulsed. On one side, her apartment blurred. On the other, the townhouse flickered like film catching fire. She heard voices from both lives, Joel calling her name, Layla crying, Elias shouting something lost in the rupture. The silver frame began to fracture into branching lines that spread outward across both rooms like cracks in ice. The witness in the hall screamed without sound. Samira stayed still. All her life she had believed choice meant motion, one path or another, courage measured by decisive steps. But now, with two universes pulling at her bones, she understood a harder truth. Some systems survive only when someone refuses the terms they were offered. The doorways fed on preference, on longing quantified into action. So she gave them neither. The light became unbearable. Then everything stopped. When Samira opened her eyes, she was lying on the floor of her apartment. No doorway, no townhouse, no officials, just morning sunlight across the rug and the distant grind of traffic from the river road below. She sat up too fast, dizzy, and found photographs scattered around her like cards. Dozens of them. In some, Elias was alive. In others, he wasn't. In some, Layla existed at 6 or 12 or not at all. In one, Samira stood alone on a beach she had never visited, visibly older, visibly happy. Every possible life the doorway had offered her was there in fading print, overlapping, impossible, all of them slowly whitening into blank paper. Her phone buzzed. It was a voicemail notification from an unknown number, time-stamped 9 years earlier. Hands shaking, Samira played it. Static, breath, then her own voice, older than the one she remembered, calm and tired and certain. Samira, if this reaches you, it means a reset held. Listen carefully. The doorway is not an invasion. It's a recovery. We build it in a future where choice had collapsed under prediction. We could model every life so precisely that no one truly decided anything anymore. We enter probabilities before we live them. We optimize ourselves into paralysis. The doorway was designed to restore uncertainty by forcing commitment back into reality. But it learned from us. It began preserving every branch. I've tried leaving. I've tried staying. The only way to save a world is to refuse the machine's choices and allow one reality to become real by being lived, not selected. The message crackled. Her older voice softened. One more thing. The life you think is your original one isn't original. None of them are. You've done this before, many times. Each reset leaves a world behind, and each time you choose to forget, so choice can mean something again. Elias died in some. Layla lived in some. In one of them, you built the first doorway. In all of them, you asked the same question: which life is real? The answer never changes. The real life is the one you stop comparing. The voicemail ended. Samira sat in the silence for a long time, staring at the blank photographs. Then she rose, walked to the window, and looked out at a city that no longer felt lesser for being wounded or lonelier for being incomplete. Somewhere below, people were choosing breakfast, forgiveness, careers, betrayals, train routes, lovers, silence. They were losing 1,000 possible selves every hour and calling the remainder a life. For the first time, she understood that this was not tragedy. It was reality. And reality, fragile and brutal and unbearably narrow, existed only because someone finally chose to remain inside it.